Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m, the 6th of July, and you are watching episode 55 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Nuclear Energy, New Government, Old Roadblocks, is my guest, Dr. John Harries. John is a physicist of 30 years career at the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, including 3 years as counsellor in nuclear science at the Australian Embassy in Washington, DC. He was also advisor to the Royal Commission into the British nuclear weapons test in Australia. John is a past president and current secretary of the Australian Nuclear Association. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Bill.
Back in April, we had Dr. Mark Ho come on and give us a rundown on nuclear energy in the past, its history. And then he returned for another episode later on and gave us a bit of an insight on technology, how it was advancing. Now, I approached him basically because Australia had cut the French contract and was looking and agreed on getting a nuclear option for our submarines. Mm-hmm. And there was general partisan acceptance of that. And actually the conversation within the public was much more favourable to nuclear energy than what it was in the past. So based on that, I thought we're going fairly swimmingly in regards to moving on and at least putting nuclear power into the mix of our energy requirements, and also just building up the capability of a nuclear industry in Australia, because we do hold 33% or so of the world's uranium reserves. So we've got plenty of potential, and we've also been mining and making yellowcake for a couple of decades now. So we've got the basis there. But then just recently, we've had this change of government, and it's become a question in regards to their favouritism for one sort of power over another. And we had Mr. Bowen on, not just recently, in an interview, sort of highlighting some of the problems he perceives with nuclear power. And so just before I start, can I just share this video with you?
Yes, go ahead.
The coalition's suggestion that fixing the energy crisis should include a nuclear option ignites an explosive response.
They want that debate? They really want to argue that? Bring it on. It's just a complete joke.
He says it doesn't stack up practically or economically.
We have a cost of living crisis, energy prices going through the roof, and what's their big bright idea? Let's have the most expensive form of energy we can possibly think of.
Chris Bowen does concede, though, that finding a cleaner and cheaper solution won't be easy or fast.
There is no silver bullet.
Yesterday's ministerial crisis meeting settling on an action plan in the short-term emergency measures to ensure sufficient gas and coal is provided, and
I need to turn that off.
Allowing market operator AEMO to buy and store gas to prevent further crises.
Something which would have been used.
Okay, we're back. So that was his interview that sort of got me wanting to revisit this conversation. So, John, do you think Mr. Bowen's sort of fair in regards to his perception of nuclear power and what it has to offer in the future?
I think he's wrong, basically. And I don't know quite why he had to... It sounded like a brain snap to me. I can't quite see why he totally ignored one of the, 4 major low-carbon sources of electricity. Technology is being used all around the world. It's a technology that's being used. It's well used. It's been around for a long time. And it's not the most expensive. I don't know where he gets these ideas from, but there's other people who put their same arguments forth, so I suppose he gets them from other people, but he could actually look a bit closer at the information.
I think it's very interesting in regards to, we've got a lot of examples around the world of nuclear power use, and France would have to be the poster child of nuclear energy as far as the normal grid situation. They've had a nuclear capability on their grid for decades and decades, and it's probably 70 or more % of their power requirements, and actually backs up a lot of other European countries when they're sort of running a little bit short. So can you give us a bit of a understanding in regards to what Australian Nuclear Association's role is in regarding to furthering the discussion on nuclear energy?
Let's first of all go firstly, but back slightly towards the front. Macron just this week has talked about installing 5 or 6 new large nuclear power plants in France, keeping the present fleet operating and putting new plants in to give them the reliable energy supply for the future. But I suppose we, the ANA, are keen to sort of keep the debate going in Australia. We keep trying to put the information out there. We do, I guess. We talk to whoever we can. But there are some political people who seem to have got themselves stuck in a trench and are not they're unwilling to listen sometimes.
I think the other big thing is if the focus is, especially on regards to this government, is and all persuasions now is net zero by 2050. It's pretty hard to conceive that you would leave nuclear out of the discussion anyway.
Well, it certainly is. I mean, one can have small amounts up to 40% wind and solar, but as soon as you get more than that, you have great difficulty not having a reliable backup. You have to have a lot of gas in the system, which is a fossil fuel, or somehow very much more hydro, but that's even more problematic.
I suppose the other thing is Mr. Bowen, it goes right back to the Rudds and Gillard governments and sort of that. So he may be a bit entrenched in his outlook. Is that a problem?
But Labor hasn't always been so anti-nuclear. I think for a long time they were very much saying, well, it's a technology we should have in the system. I mean, back in the day, many years ago, when we had when I first joined the Australian Atomic Energy Commission, we were going to have a power reactor at Jervis Bay. That was 50 years ago. Tenders were called. The trouble was the nuclear at that stage couldn't compete with coal. Electricity is going to be twice as much as the coal plants, which can just be work. But now we're trying to close down the coal plants. We want something reliable to take their place. The nuclear is the logical source.
Is it also that some people are just locked into this perception of the old type of technology in regards to nuclear power plants, and that come up with flashes of 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima? Is that something we need to sort of counter?
Well, I think some people will keep quoting those, but they, it's funny that they do that with the nuclear industry, but they don't do it with the airline industry. I mean, reactors have moved forward since these accidents have happened. And really, overall, the number of reactors and the amount of power they've produced, they're a safe source of electricity.
We also have a bit of an idea from the situation in the United States. They used to be prolific builders of nuclear power stations in the 70s and through to the 80s, but it's dropped off, and they seem to not have the expertise that they once had, or encountering problems, because we've had the last 2 reactors to be built in the state of Georgia that have run into time overruns, budget overruns, and I think there are maybe heading up towards 7 to 9 years of behind schedule, and a budget from, I think it might have been $9 or $10 billion, and now blown out to nearly $30 billion. Is that something that maybe some people fear in regards to, because we've never been really good managers of big projects in this country. We usually end up with overruns and the taxpayer picking up a lot of extra costs.
I don't know. I think we have a lot of expertise. Anyway, go back to these two plants in the US. They were AP1000s, I think, and they've certainly been very expensive. They were first of a kind. US didn't have a supply chain in the system. You know, they hadn't built reactors for so long. There was an awful lot they had to learn. A couple of these same reactors have been built in China and also in South Korea, and they're operating. Well, the ones in China are operating. The ones in South Korea are nearing completion, and because they're following on the first of a kind plant, which was being built in the US. They learned all the lessons, and these are being built on time and on budget. US ones have problems with their supply chain.
I think the other thing that happened is too, as they were building them, and with Fukushima happening, there's probably additional design changes that happen.
The regulatory system also changed. The regulations also required them to change things, but.
So I think that's probably one of the big things too. If you in the process of building something to a plan, and then something comes to that you have to change, it adds complete additional costs and time to the scale of getting it completed. Would those problems or all those designs now be sort of sealed, and basically you could go ahead if you wanted to start again? You wouldn't have to be facing any sort of those sort of problems.
Oh, because you'd be picking up a design which is taken into account all of those updates. So if we were putting in a nuclear power plants, we would be using a design which has been regulated, approved overseas, and I would think built overseas, and we'd be building a plant which is a known entity, not first of a kind.
I would also presume the Australian Nuclear Association would have a complete overview of projects going on throughout the world. I think one of the more recent places of interest was Saudi Arabia, and they're sort of looking at nuclear energy. I'm not sure if they're in the process of building one, but it was, you know.
Well, I think you're talking about UAE, aren't you? United Arab Emirates, rather than Saudi Arabia. They've just bought 4 large nuclear power plants from South Korea. I'll even show you a picture of them. Good luck. Two of us can share the screen. Share. These are 4 Korean APR-14,000, so they're 1,400 megawatts electrical. They decided in 2009 they were going to have nuclear to save their oil. And they bought these plants from South Korea. And that shows them being built in 2013. And then the picture down the bottom is in March 2020, with the 4 plants completed construction. The first two of those plants are now providing electricity into the United Arab Emirates grid, and it's been a very effective and on-time process.
I think that's probably one of the things. South Korea is probably one of the few countries that have had ongoing expertise. Even looking at, like you said, the French are looking now to bring more. Do you think they would have some of that sort of expertise gap at the moment? Because I don't think they've built any for a while.
The present time they're building one, which is also delayed, and they're building the one in Finland, which is also delayed. There are EPRs. And should stop screen, shouldn't I? So France has some continuing expertise, but it hasn't built up to the level of plants. I think if you're building them regularly, you have the engineering expertise, you have the facilities to do it. If you let it all lapse, then you have great difficulty re-establishing it. South Korea clearly has building their own plants. These are plants which had been built in South Korea, and they're now just in the process of restarting all their construction process again.
So if we went ahead with nuclear energy on a large scale like that, we would be needing to seek expertise or put in sort of orders to places like South Korea that had new standing and supply chain and expertise, rather than say running off to Westinghouse in the United States and say build us one when they sort of been out of the loop for a while.
Yes, I think so. I think so. But you know, even these plants here, these UAE plants, the nuclear bits in the middle is where I guess a lot of import, but a lot of it is more standard but high quality civil engineering, which Australia can do and has the expertise to do. So it's, you know,
well, I suppose in regards to a nuclear power station, it's the same as a coal. It's the nuclear part of it is the boiler, and and really you still need the rest of the pipes and turbines and steam and cooling and all that, like you do for all plants. So the real expertise we just need is that central part of the equation.
Let me show you this picture. This is a picture of these APR 1000s, which are share screen. You see that?
It will be coming. There it is. It's on screen now.
That's an APR 1000, which is a South Korean design. And you can see the thing in the middle is the reactor core, which is where all the energy is coming from and heat's coming from. And the uranium in that is changed, or stays in the core for about 3 years. It's half is changed, or a third of it's changed every 18 months. And then it's got the turbines and the steam and the stuff, but all of the nuclear bit is just a bit in the middle.
And that's basically the technology we need to import, but the rest of it's probably something we could actually participate in the
design. We'd probably pick up the design, but we'd have our engineers putting it together, making it suitable for local conditions.
In regards to these type of reactors, they're a fairly big investment in that. Is there other opportunities for Australia in regards to the new technology and the modulars and things like that in the future, or is that sort of high risk at the moment?
I think these ones are almost too big for our grid. This one's 1,000 megawatts, and when it's being refueled, it's very difficult to take it off the grid with that amount of it. We could do with something smaller. And so there's a lot of these small modular reactors being talked about now, which have got powers, let's say more like 300 or less megawatts. And there's a number of them being built, well, almost being built, but they're not commercially. You can't go along with your checkbook at the moment and say, oh, please, sir, send one tomorrow. But they're very close to going. The Canadians are putting one in the Darlington plant, that'd be a new General Electric small modular reactor. Saskatchewan is talking about having them as well. US is talking about new scale. These are a whole lot of different reactors which have been licensed, and construction is about to start. And once these are built, once these are made, once these are available, they will be built in factories and be sent out. But then again, you still have to have all the other civil engineering around them to make them work.
So basically just getting the centerpiece imported, and the rest we've got to put the pipes and the
pipes and stuff.
and the turbines and the
Yeah.
cooling system and all those in it, which will help us develop our own industry anyway. So that's
I think
and provide employment and expertise.
Yeah, I think we tend to buy our turbines from overseas anyway, when we even for our coal plants.
Well, there's not many things we do make, unfortunately.
Well, the wind farms are all built in China, so.
In regards to the smaller modules, can they be deployed further around the grid rather than, like at the moment, I think Queensland, we've got basically 8 major coal-fired power stations. And I think the most northerly one is just north of Rockhampton. So everything like that above that is just on the grid.
Yeah.
Would the new smaller modular ones lend themselves to sort of placement beyond where we've currently got the coal-fired power stations? Because you need water and you need all the other bits and pieces for the whole station. So how far do you think we could actually deploy these far as more widely across the landscape?
I don't think there's any problem with doing that. I think we tend to say put them in where the coal stations are, because that seems to be the cheapest place to put them. But if we're on the edges of the grid, then that could equally be a very useful place to put them to save on transmission lines. And there's different sizes of these plants. So these, talking about this at 300 megawatts, but in Canada, they're talking about having, 10 megawatt ones at all their remote stations. Mine sites in all North Canada using diesel, and there's a whole lot of reactors being designed to be sent to these smaller places.
So they'd be off the grid sort of type places rather than
They'd be off
on
the
the
grid sort of
grid.
places. But I can't see why it can't be, we're talking about this distributed grid now for lots of these solar and wind.
Well, places like the Northwest Mineral Province, Mount Isa, and that would be sort of an ideal sort of place that has a reasonably high consumption of electricity, but it's at the end of the world, and it's not even going to get connected to the main grid until Copper String 2.0 happens to run a new line out to there. So, and the other thing is it provides an opportunity for regional Australia to open up more areas if there's a decent power source, because we probably have a lot of potential in this country for more exploration, more mineral processing in that. And I'm sure people in Sydney and Melbourne and that would like it to be the processing side of it to be as far removed from site as possible. So if we could process it on the areas that we actually dig it up from, would probably be a pretty good idea.
Well, you mean put in nuclear? I don't see why we don't have the nuclear plants close to big cities. I can't see that. After all, we have the ANSTO reactor, which is in a suburb of Sydney, and that's only 20 megawatts, but it is a nuclear reactor, which is relatively close to me.
Yeah, but I'm sort of looking at the idea of how far you can run a piece of wire before you have to put something onto that piece of wire to sort of provide power. Transmission lines are notoriously loss effective.
I would have thought, Mount Isa and Olympic Dam would be ideal places to put the appropriate size.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. That they're the sort of places be good to put their own facility in.
Give them a reliable energy source, and they're using it 24/7, so they want something which just continue to operate. The wind farm,
in regards to the modules and that, do you think there would be or what would it take to get people over the sort of situation, well, not in my backyard?
I mean, I think if it comes with jobs, I think that makes all the difference. I mean, I think the coal provinces at the moment would be dead keen to have a nuclear power plant if they're going to close the coal mines. I don't know about the Queensland ones, but it's certainly the case in Hunter Valley and Latrobe, where a nuclear plant would be a source of employment, keep everyone and a long
They
term.
are, coal power stations are a big employer of people in the local area. Is the employment situation in regards to nuclear the sort of similar sort of
it's a similar
workforce
thing, similar workforce. Less people carrying the coal around, and probably more people writing papers and, you know, keeping all the procedures in place.
Is that like people running around with clipboards? I'm always worried about people with clipboards, whether they actually do anything.
But I think it's a similar employment.
In regards to,
you don't have a coal miner, do you?
pardon?
You don't have a coal mine employment, though. You have the nuclear power plant employment, which would be much similar to more of a coal plant than a coal mine.
Just moving away a little bit from the power side of it, what's the Australian Nuclear Energy Association sort of role in sort of furthering the nuclear industry in other areas, like maybe enrichment or maybe storage of waste and things like that? Do you have a role in those sort of things?
I don't know about a role, but up to now, there's been too much enrichment around the world that it's been not economic to even think about doing enriching in Australia. We probably should be improving our uranium. At present time, we ship out raw uranium yellow cake. This could certainly be.
So how much processing's left in it that's be value added for Australia?
Well, Australia could be shipping out actually uranium itself rather than yellow cake. So convert it into uranium hexafluoride, which is used in the enrichment plant. But again, usually there's excess capability around the world, or there has been. But a lot of it has been in Russia and the US. I'm not quite sure whether we use Russia at the moment for these things.
Might not be a good idea. But the other thing is, if nuclear energy expands, doesn't that situation change in regards to you need a greater volume of material for fuel than that? Yeah. Say Britain goes to more electric nuclear, France, Europe, and then Asia as well. And instead of just, I think there's only how many nuclear power stations in the world? Less than 400? 440
about.
Yeah. Well, say if that over time that triples or quadruples.
There's going to be a lot more uranium processing and uranium enrichment. Yes.
Does that create the situation where it becomes more likely that Australia would be a bigger player in the fuel chain line and value adding?
Well, I think it's possible, but I guess I don't know enough about it really to know how it all fits together for that. I think it's an opportunity, but I'd leave it to the companies that are involved now to say, well, is Australia an appropriate place to put a new plant? If we have cheap electricity and a source of uranium, it sounds like a good opportunity. But there was a lot of interest about 30 years ago in putting an enrichment plant in, but economically it didn't stand up. You know, there's big companies, the big money available, but it didn't happen.
In going forward, and looking at Mr. Bowen's sort of position, where can we sort of go from here to sort of get the debate back into some sort of semblance of order that's a bit more favourable to at least having good dialogue over nuclear energy, or is that got to be just like rebooting the whole conversation again?
The real problem at the moment is Australia nuclear is prohibited. Nuclear energy is prohibited by legislation. And this is, of course, is a real problem, because what we need is because of legislative prohibitions, it means that there's no real interest by providers in offering a nuclear plant and what it might cost. The prohibitions were put in, 20 or 30 years ago, in part of a Senate negotiations to get some other legislation underway. And the numbers were needed, and I think they had to get some senators on board, and by putting this prohibition in, they got the senators on board and passed this legislation for nuclear regulators. But these prohibitions are actually a disincentive. We're the only major country in the world that just prohibits nuclear without even thinking about it. We don't need to decide at the moment whether we're going to have nuclear or not. We need to say it's an option that could be considered on its merits.
That legislative ban, but because it's only requires an act of parliament to actually change it, reverse it, it's not something that's set in stone like a constitutional type problem. No. It just needs a majority government in the Senate and the lower house, or bipartisan agreement to get rid of that piece of legislation and lift the ban. And the way the Australian public was moving forward with the conversation, like I said, since the decision to look at the nuclear submarine option, that was probably on the cards, a possibility. Do you think we can get that conversation back on track to actually?
I think we will in time, but when that agreement with the submarines was adopted, the government specifically said this didn't lead to the introduction of nuclear energy for power. It was only going to be for submarines. And talking about power was a totally different conversation. And that's why currently Dutton is not stepping forward on nuclear, because he was part of that process. Because in order to get the Labor Party positive about the submarine deal, they had to say very specifically in the agreement, or in a PR or the press release that came out, that this did not lead to nuclear power in the country. So I think this discussion's got to go on a little bit longer, for a few years, before we actually get to the point where we're going to separate them out.
So we could be in the situation, but going forward, that we introduce renewables to the extent that they make coal-fired stations unviable, or what I don't quite understand is a lot of the power stations, especially in Queensland, are actually in the public's hands, and so basically the government's cutting its own throat for revenue, and that by bashing the coal generators anyway. But if we get into a situation where our grid becomes completely unreliable, it's got to be a pretty hard situation in regards to, right, we've now got a grid that's unstable, we've got no insufficient backup system. It's got to be far too long for nuclear to come along and save the day, isn't it?
Well, nuclear won't save the day at the time, but we've got to consider the future goes on forever. I mean, suddenly we get to 2030, we suddenly don't stop. We still have to somehow or other keep running the society. So even if nuclear takes 10 years to build, it's still going to come and save the day in 10 years' time.
And the other thing is it ticks the box in regards to zero emissions, which is the critical part of the current conversation. Well, do you think if the situation is that 2050 targets are not likely to be met, that we'll get a bit more focus on nuclear to sort of help fill that gap in regards to the shortfall in reducing our carbon emissions?
I think it's going to come sooner. I'm going to come much sooner than that, as we suddenly find with more wind and solar in the system. It's going to become more unreliable. The coal stations become less economic to run because they keep being switched off and on. It's going to be once we have it shown that the system doesn't work. Present time was, we haven't really had any real blackouts. We have blackouts in South Australia, but not very many others.
But that's sort of opening us up to a situation where we could have an unreliable power situation in regards to we actually go without power at periods. That's sort of a pretty poor way to look at planning.
It is. It is. Well, I don't know. That seems to be the politics at the moment, doesn't it? I think if we're going to get to net zero by 2050, we have to have nuclear in the mix.
Well, that's what most
do it with
people.
just wind and solar. We put a bit more pumped hydro in.
No.
That's flooding valleys is also a planning nightmare.
But that's what most reasonable people would think, and you would think you would need to start planning and talking about that now, rather than wait to the situation when you're in a deep hole that you can't seem to get out of.
Yeah, I agree. I don't want to say, but the current government went into this election saying we're going to have wind and solar, and this is going to reduce your power prices by some percent, by so many dollars, without even thinking about how it's going to be firmed up.
But the other thing is too, we've already had the examples. We're seeing the examples in Europe at the moment, especially in Germany, where the amount of money that they've spent, Germany in particular, how much money it's pumped into renewables and how fragile its system is when the sort of fossil fuels become less available and more expensive, and which is all basically self-inflicted anyway.
Well, they're opening more coal plants, aren't they? So
yes, but we're not. I mean, we're not. We've got a government that's just turned around and told us we're going this way. We're going renewables, and that's it. Is that sort of too blinkered approach to the problems that could happen or will happen if we do that?
It's just not recognising the problems that are really there. I don't know. I think we're going to keep talking to this government, but it's going to take a little while to get them to turn around.
So going forward, people like yourself and Mark Ho and others, what sort of avenues in conversation have you got to sort of talk to people who are making decisions of what's available in the future for them?
Well, we can make ourselves available to talk to them, but in fact, the decisions have been made by people, but they're responding to public. So we're really going out to the public a lot to talk to provosts and other clubs and different people to try and say what is really happening on the nuclear field. It is an affordable energy source. It's a good energy source. It's mature technology. It's something that we in Australia can use. If other countries are putting it in, then why aren't we?
But I think
I'm not answering your question. I mean, the difficulty is how do we turn the government around? There's a lot of vested interest in these other fields as well. Our difficulty is that there's an awful lot of money in putting in solar farms and wind farms, so they can spend money on advertising them, their system, saying how fantastic it all is, because it feeds into the system. But
the other thing is,
doesn't have that.
With those systems, the realities are not being talked about. I mean, no one talks about the fact with the renewables option, you need to build at least six times the nameplate capacity of your peak requirement. You can reduce that to 4 times if you can put complete backup to it, either batteries or pumped hydro. But this is not actually being sort of mentioned out there. I mean, I think
they always compare gigawatts versus gigawatts installed, and a gigawatt of solar power is equivalent to, well, I suppose a gigawatt of nuclear power is equivalent to 6 gigawatts of solar power.
Yeah, on the basis of its efficiency and availability.
And then it's another factor too, because the solar panels only last 20 years or so, with a nuclear plant runs 60.
I suppose that's another factor. I mean, a lot of people in the past have been a bit wary of the disposal from nuclear waste and that. Is that now a less of a problem, or it certainly doesn't get a lot of mention these days, but have other countries put things in place to sort of make sure that they do this, store their waste safely, and it's not an issue for the public to be concerned about?
Well, they're all looking after their waste. All these 440 power stations look after their own waste at the moment. There's relatively, I mean, technically, there's no reason to put it back in the ground in geological formations. Uranium has come out of the ground radioactive, and you put this stuff back in the ground in the right location. But only Finland and lots of countries are putting in disposal facilities, but only Finland is about to do it. The US has got one, but they're not getting rid of power reactor fuel at the moment. It's easy to manage, it's easy to look after, and the pressure isn't on it to get it, dispose of it. Most of it's stored at the sites of the power station in concrete.
Would that situation likely change if we suddenly, or over time, go from 400 power plants to 800 and 1200, and that? Do you perceive it to become an issue there, or we have the technology to completely manage it?
I think we have to have facilities for disposing of it, or more facilities to process or recycle the fuel that comes out. The fuel that comes out still has got quite a lot of remaining power in it, or use energy in it. So if you recycle it or reprocess it, you can collect that, you can get the uranium out, you can get the plutonium out, and then put those back in another reactor. So there are means of using it. I don't think it's a major problem. It's a cost, and it's got to be done properly. It can be properly managed in a proper facility.
But over the life of the project and that, it still works out as an economical viability, because a nuclear power station can run 50 to 60 years.
Yes, and there's so little waste that comes out per volume. I don't have the picture here, but there's a nice picture of all the waste from Switzerland, all in one smallish room, all in concrete containers. And this is from all of the power stations, or 4 or 5 power stations in Switzerland.
Will that situation change with the new technology? Because I've heard of things like pebble reactors, fluorine reactors, and things like that. So going forward,
some of them, if you go to fast reactors or go to liquid metal reactors, it's probably easier to manage it. But most of the reactors being built today are all similar light water reactors, very similar to reactors now operating. They're pressurized water reactors. So it's all, I think it's manageable. I mean, no one's talking about the waste from all these other technologies. I mean, if you look at the millions and millions of coal ash, tons of coal ash or residues, and the millions of solar panels. What did it,
well, one thing about coal ash, you actually can use it for concrete and that, so it does have a bit of a use. But
some of
I think,
isn't it one that was fly ash and the bottom ash? What's the difference? Anyway, there's different.
Yeah, I think there's 2 different sorts. But that's another thing that no one's really talking about with the renewables, is the actual disposal of the items, the hardware, especially when you consider that they only have a 20-year life cycle basically, and if it's batteries as backup, well, they'll be lucky to have 10 years. So you've got a massive disposal problem over time, compared to sort of the fuel load of a nuclear reactor.
True. Well, yes, they're all issues, but nuclear waste can be managed, and it has been demonstrated by overseas experience that it's effectively and safely managed.
Is there potential for any countries to make money off the disposal process, like storage or that, or is everyone pretty well
Look, there'd be a lot of
able to look after their own.
South Australia looked very closely at that. They had a Royal Commission 5 years ago, looking at the potential for that, doing a regional waste disposal facility for high-level waste. And there's a vast amount of money to be made by that. It's very hard for Australia to start doing that if other countries aren't doing it first. You think, oh, there must be some problem.
Oh, the thing is, you don't put something in place unless there's a market for it. So you probably need to suss out whether that you've got customers, likely customers, who be happy to sort of shift their waste from their country to your country, sort of thing, to get it out of their hair.
Yes.
So that's a commercial decision that sort of has to be investigated.
Yeah, but the government's got to allow the process to run before you reach that point of saying, is the customer really there?
But the thing is, there's not a lot of risk. Say if Australia went into that sort of, well, we lift the ban and we looked at the nuclear industry and we looked at disposal and that, we would be able to safely store nuclear waste. It's not some intrinsic problem that's, manifests itself into a bigger problem later on. It's a manageable
problem. I mean, the fuel elements from the Opal the reactor at Lucas Heights here was processed in France and UK and has been shipped back and is now in concrete containers, canisters, which is licensed for long-term storage and transport at Lucas Heights here. They're quite heavy containers. But the power reactor's got a similar thing.
I think too, isn't there an agreement worldwide in regards to if a country enriches uranium and it takes the fuel back, or is that not accurate?
No, it's more the origin of the uranium rather than who enriches it. So when Australia exports uranium, it's Australian origin uranium, Australian origin nuclear material, and that Australia follows it where this uranium goes to make sure, and it has to be go into a power reactor and can't be used for weapons. So Australia knows where all the uranium produced in Australia has ended up.
But it doesn't have any obligations to get that return to it because it didn't enrich it.
No.
But those countries that enrich, they've got obligations to take it back?
No.
No, the country using it keeps it.
Each country using it keeps it.
Okay.
Some reactors are sold, well, I suppose, on the basis that the country takes the spent fuel back. What's the Russian reactors, which are now being built in Egypt and places?
Well, that'd be a financial negotiated contract beforehand, and obviously the country having the reactor would be paying for someone else to keep the leftovers. So it would be a cost to that nation on top of actually the reactor and all that sort of stuff.
Yes, yeah, and you're really sort of paying for it in the contract price for your reactor you put when you bought it, and the fuel that you bought.
Going forward, do you actually see any situation that would sort of prompt a bipartisan approach to sort of remove the ban on nuclear power? Like if we got into a situation where renewables are not making the grade, and we know we have to have a base load support, and the fact is we've got to get rid of coal. We have to have something to replace that base load power. Is that the sort of conversation we say, well, you can't really get, if the conversation eventuates where renewables can't keep us operating without the coal, then it becomes imperative that nuclear replaces the coal as the base load. Is that what the situation has to be to actually make the conversation turn in the favour of nuclear power?
Well, it'd be one option, but I think it's more likely to be a smaller region which suddenly says, we need a reliable energy source and we would like to have nuclear. I mean, if one of the states suddenly decided that they need it, or a mining company decided this was the most economic way of solving their problem and doing their processing, that would open up the opportunity. We need people actually wanting the technology.
So, but there still needs that first shift by the Commonwealth to remove that ban, and then it's basically up to different jurisdictions to decide on, because really
decides it. If the jurisdiction wants it, it's not. I don't think the government should be saying we're putting in nuclear. The government should say we're not standing in the way of it.
Well, it boils down to is the government shouldn't be picking winners.
No.
I think that's the problem that we've moved into, is governments decided that this is the winner and this is the way we've got to go, and then on top of that we're going to double down with making hydrogen and things like that, which just extrapolates the problem of how much energy you need to make that part of the energy equation. So that's a problem when governments pick winners.
Yeah, as I was saying, and then they subsidise them. They should just step back and let people who want things have the opportunity to get it. They can regulate it to make sure it's safe and effective, but they shouldn't be picking winners.
Well, I think that started years ago. I mean, even with rooftop solars, I mean, it was basically subsidising people to put solar on their roofs, and that was in the first instance from the Commonwealth supporting that system in regards to their initial grant. But then you had situations where state governments came into the equation and provided feed-in tariffs, and I think some of the original feed-in tariffs in New South Wales, I think, was up to 68 cents a kilowatt. In Queensland, it's 44. I think that runs out in 2028. But that's a massive.
Not that much in Queensland, is it? Because here in New South Wales, in Sydney, it's about 7 cents a kilowatt hour.
Oh yeah, for new ones. But I'm talking about when they originally went into the schemes. It was as high as 68 in New South Wales and 44. Because I know people down the street who got into the system when it was first came out, and they're still getting paid 44 cents for a kilowatt that they feed into the grid. People who have come along later on, they're down to about 6 or 7 cents, which is probably not reasonable, but that's fine. But the thing is, it boils down to a lot of people, either their house might not be in the right situation to benefit from a solar panel system because it's just not orientated right, or people are in state housing or in a rental or in units and that can't take advantage of it. So they're the ones who are lumbered with the subsidising of these feed-in tariffs, which is not fair. So it's not only just a matter of them picking winners and subsidising the main corporations and that. It's also how they discriminate against different customers and their ability to sort of enter into these renewables.
Yeah, I guess you could, in one sense, I suppose those early systems were effective in that we have so much solar on roofs that there's no need to subsidise it at all.
And I think the other thing that we also probably didn't look at, that a lot of people don't take into account, how much problems this fluctuation in power causes to the grids, and how much it has to be upgraded, how much more control. With large power coal stations and nuclear stations, all those sort of things in regards to are managed in their scheduling and that for maintenance, that they didn't need a smart grid. The grid could be dumb as whatever and just pulling a few levers. Does adding nuclear power onto the system, because it's some of the plants are so much bigger, would that pose a problem to grid management, or is that not an issue?
I think the grid can readily do it. It's important. All the current plants, nuclear plants, can load follow to some extent. The small ones do it better than the large ones. But after all, I mean, the grid manages with coal plants at the moment. More than half the energy is from coal plants, some of which are not very flexible.
I think too, it's like, I think the size of the turbines and that individual turbines have sort of worked their way up from, I think they used to be about 160 megawatts, and I think Kogan Creek or something is a single turbine unit of 750 megawatts. That's a lot of power to go on and off at one stage.
It is. It is. Well, you can slow it down a bit, though.
in a normal in one of the AR1000s or 1100s and that, how many turbines would they sort of run? You know, 4 or 5 or whatever. So you've got actually a smaller number of turbines that you can sort of take out of the system.
Look,
and also
I'm not sure, but I think they have several, but I don't know what they have on those.
Because that provides some flexibility in regards to scheduling maintenance and that, because they're the items that got bearings and all those sort of things that you need to look. And then obviously it has a chance to have a look at the injection, the steam injection system and that for each individual turbine if it needs to be maintained. So it would have the same maintenance sort of philosophy as a coal-fired power station, as far as that extended part from the reactor.
Yes.
Okay, look, we've come up on the hour and that.
Right.
Is there anything you'd like to sort of offer in regards to Mr. Bowen's sort of outburst in regards to nuclear is too expensive, too slow, and all those sort of things, that maybe would sort of enlighten people to say, well, let's be a bit more open to discussion?
I think Chris Bowen was wrong when he said that. He's something that has been said by other people, and we just have to keep putting the data out that nuclear power is affordable, low carbon, reliable, and other countries are using it. Other countries are putting in nuclear power plants. So I don't see why Australia shouldn't be following examples of the UK, France, North Korea, South Korea. South Korea.
Well, and the other thing is they're selling the technology to much smaller countries than what we are. And I presume they'll gradually get a lineup of more countries. So it's sort of remarkable that, you know, entities, nations smaller than us are looking at those options, and we've just got a closed door on it.
It is amazing, because, you know, even countries like Uganda and Egypt are looking very strongly at nuclear. Turkey's putting in nuclear power plants. Bangladesh is. Australia should be we make our own decision up, but there's absolutely no reason why we should be frightened of the technology.
Okay, then. Look, we've gone over the hour. I'd like to thank you for coming on tonight, and I hope you can get the conversation bubbling along in regards to moving forward, and especially in regards to the opportunities for a wider nuclear energy industry rather than just power itself. But hopefully the Australian Nuclear Association is in good hands with people like yourself going forward.
Right. Thank you, Bill. Good to talk about nuclear. And
okay, if you can just stay on the line for a bit, I'll have a little chat with you in a minute. If you enjoyed tonight's show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook channel, Facebook page, and subscribe to our our YouTube channel. Next week, we'll be looking at a guest, Bill Johnston from Bomb Watch, and he'll be giving us some information in regards to his research in regards to temperatures across Australia and the activities of the Australian Bureau of Meteorology over the last several years in the climate debate. So please join me again next week.